Imagine walking into court expecting to hear about serious crimes, only to discover someone is suing themselves, or trying to take a fast food giant to court for not making their coffee cup hot enough. Sounds like a comedy sketch, right? But no, these are real cases in American legal history, and today, we're diving into the strangest, most unbelievable lawsuits that actually made it into a courtroom. Some are hilarious, some are shocking, and some are so bizarre you'll wonder how they ever made it past the filing desk. Let's start with one of the most jaw-dropping cases ever recorded. 1. The man who sued himself, Robert Lee Brock, 1995. In 1995, a prison inmate named Robert Lee Brock decided to sue himself. Yes, you heard that right. Brock filed a $5 million lawsuit against his own person, claiming he had violated his own civil rights by getting drunk and committing the crimes that landed him in prison. The logic? He argued that as both the plaintiff and the defendant, the state should pay, since he couldn't work in prison to cover the damages. The judge dismissed it, of course, calling it ingenious but frivolous. Still, the story made headlines and is now one of the most famous examples of how wild the legal system can get. 2. The McDonald's hot coffee case, 1992. Now this one is often misunderstood. In 1992, Stella Liebeck, a 79-year-old woman, spilled McDonald's coffee on her lap and suffered third-degree burns. Most people think she just sued because coffee was hot. But here's the twist: McDonald's served its coffee at 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than what is safe for consumption. Liebeck spent 8 days in the hospital and needed skin grafts. When McDonald's refused to cover her medical bills, she sued. The jury awarded her nearly $3 million in punitive damages, a message to the company that safety mattered. Though the award was reduced later, this case changed corporate policies nationwide. Ironically, it's now joked about as a silly lawsuit, but in reality, it exposed serious negligence. 3. The Haunted House Lawsuit, Stambovsky vs. Ackley, 1991. In 1991, a man named Jeffrey Stambovsky bought a house in Nyack, New York, only to later discover it was locally famous as a haunted house. The previous owner, Helen Ackley, had even told newspapers about ghostly apparitions in the home. Stambovsky argued that Ackley should have disclosed this reputation before selling. The New York court actually sided with him, ruling that since the seller had promoted the house as haunted, she couldn't deny it later. This case became known as the Ghostbusters ruling, and it's one of the only times American courts have officially recognized a house as legally haunted. 4. The burglar who sued the homeowner, 1998. Here's one that infuriated the public. In 1998, a man in Pennsylvania broke into a house through the garage window, only to get stuck for over a week. He survived by drinking soda and eating dry dog food he found in the garage. When he was finally discovered and arrested, he turned around and sued the homeowners for mental anguish. Believe it or not, he actually won a settlement out of court, though much less than he demanded. Cases like this sparked debates about how criminals sometimes abuse the legal system to their advantage. If you thought a burglar suing his victims was the peak of absurdity, buckle up, because the next set of cases push the limits of what you'd think could ever happen in a courtroom. 5. The man who tried to sue God, 2005, Nebraska. In 2005, Nebraska State Senator Ernie Chambers filed a lawsuit against God, yes, the divine being himself. Chambers claimed God had caused widespread death, destruction, and terrorization of millions upon millions of Earth's inhabitants. So why would a respected politician do this? Chambers admitted he filed the case to make a point about frivolous lawsuits clogging up the courts. Since God, he argued, was all-knowing and omnipresent, he couldn't claim he hadn't been served the lawsuit. The judge eventually dismissed the case because, of course, you can't serve legal papers to God. But the case became legendary for sparking debates about the limits of legal systems. 6. The $54 million pants lawsuit, 2005, Washington, D.C. This case is as ridiculous as it sounds. In 2005, Judge Roy Pearson took his pants to a local dry cleaner, but they allegedly lost them. Instead of settling for a refund or replacement, Pearson sued the dry cleaner for $54 million. His reasoning? He claimed the store's satisfaction guaranteed sign was misleading, and that he suffered emotional distress from the missing pants. The case dragged on for years before being thrown out, and Pearson became infamous nationwide. The family who owned the dry cleaners nearly went bankrupt fighting the case. This lawsuit is still studied in law schools as a prime example of legal excess. 7. The Pepsi Points Jet lawsuit, Leonard vs. PepsiCo, 1995. Back in the 1990s, Pepsi ran a promotional campaign called Pepsi Points. Customers could collect points from Pepsi products and redeem them for prizes like t-shirts, sunglasses, and even mountain bikes. But their commercial jokingly showed a Harrier fighter jet available for 7 million Pepsi points. Enter John Leonard, a business student, who figured out he could technically collect enough points by investing about $700,000. He submitted his claim for the jet. Pepsi refused, saying the ad was clearly a joke. Leonard sued, insisting the commercial was a legitimate offer. The court sided with Pepsi, ruling that no reasonable person would believe Pepsi was giving away a $23 million military jet. Still, the case became so iconic that Netflix even made a documentary about it, Pepsi, Where's My Jet? 8. The woman who sued Universal Studios over Halloween Horror Nights, 2011. In 2011, a woman visited Universal Studios in Florida for their famous Halloween Horror Nights. After being scared by an actor with a chainsaw, without the chain, she fell and twisted her ankle. Instead of brushing it off, she filed a lawsuit against the park for emotional distress and physical injury. Her argument was that the park went too far with the scare tactics. But the court dismissed it, reminding her that the entire event was marketed as an extreme scare experience. This case showed how even when people voluntarily sign up for something, lawsuits can still follow. 9. The Batman vs. Batman lawsuit, 2008. Here's a weird one. In 2008, the mayor of a town in Turkey called Batman sued Warner Bros. And director Christopher Nolan, claiming the use of the name Batman in the Dark Knight movies violated the town's rights. Yes, a real town in Turkey named Batman tried to take on Hollywood. The case never went far, but it got international attention, and gave the town more publicity than it ever imagined. That closes out part 2. By now, we've gone from suing God, to pants worth $54 million, to a Pepsi jet that never took off, and even a town trying to fight Batman. But we're not done yet. In part 3, we'll finish with some of the strangest, funniest, and most head-scratching cases ever, including a man suing an airline over peanuts, a kidnapper suing his hostages, and the case of the floating house. We've already seen lawsuits about pants, Pepsi jets, and even God. But believe it or not, the rabbit hole goes even deeper. Let's finish strong with some of the strangest, funniest, and most head-scratching cases in American courtroom history. 10. The man who sued an airline over peanuts, 2009. In 2009, a man from California filed a lawsuit against Southwest Airlines because, get this, he claimed their in-flight peanuts were too small. He argued that the airline had advertised jumbo peanuts, but served him peanuts that were, in his words, measly and disappointing. He sued for false advertising and emotional distress. The court dismissed the case almost immediately, but not before it became a punchline for comedians across the country. It's still remembered as one of the pettiest lawsuits ever filed. 11. The kidnapper who sued his hostages, 1982. This one sounds straight out of a dark comedy. In 1982, a man in New York kidnapped 2 people at gunpoint and forced them to drive him around. Eventually, the victims escaped and the kidnapper was arrested. But here's where it gets crazy. While in prison, he turned around and sued his victims for breach of contract, his claim. They had agreed to drive him where he wanted, and they broke their promise by escaping. The judge threw out the case, but it still stands as one of the most outrageous abuses of the legal system ever attempted. 12. The beer company that promised fantasy girls, 1991. In 1991, a man sued Anheuser-Busch, the makers of Budweiser, because he was disappointed their beer commercials didn't deliver what they promised. You know those old Budweiser ads, where drinking a Bud magically brought bikini models running to the beach party? The plaintiff argued that he bought the beer expecting similar results, and when no fantasy women appeared, he sued for false advertising. Needless to say, the court dismissed it. But the case became a symbol of how far people will stretch the law to chase a quick payout. 13. The case of the floating house, 2004, Oregon. In 2004, a couple in Oregon sued their neighbors because their house floated. Not on water, but visually. Their home had mirrored siding that reflected so much sunlight, the neighbors claimed it made their own home look like it was levitating. They argued it caused emotional distress and ruined the enjoyment of their property. The case dragged on for months before being thrown out, but not before it gave us one of the strangest phrases in legal history, the floating house defense. 14. The man who sued Michael Jordan for looking like him, 2006. In 2006, a man from Portland, Oregon, filed a $832 million lawsuit against NBA legend Michael Jordan and Nike founder Phil Knight. His reason? He claimed he had been suffering permanent emotional distress because people constantly mistook him for Michael Jordan. He argued that Jordan's fame made his own life unbearable, since strangers wouldn't stop comparing the two. Of course, the court tossed the case, but it became an instant tabloid sensation. 15. The serial sues himself, 1995, and just to bring things full circle, let's revisit Robert Lee Brock, the prisoner who sued himself for $5 million. Believe it or not, he wasn't alone. In fact, several prisoners across the country filed copycat lawsuits against themselves in the 1990s, trying to force the state to pay damages. It didn't work, but it showed how one ridiculous idea can spread like wildfire once it hits the headlines. And there you have it, from haunted houses to pants worth millions, from suing God to suing a beer company for not delivering fantasy women, these bizarre lawsuits prove one thing: in America, you can sue anyone for almost anything. Most of these cases were dismissed, but they show how creative, and sometimes ridiculous, people can be when they think there's money to be made or a point to prove. So next time you hear about a crazy lawsuit in the news, remember, it probably isn't the first, and it definitely won't be the last.